Hi, my name's Chloe. I'm a teacher and I'm here today to talk to you about how we can use data-informed practice with Edrolo. So firstly, we need to talk about what actually are we talking about. So when we're talking about data-informed practice, we're talking about how we can use both formative and summative data to gauge our students' progress and then make some plans for what we need to do for their next steps. I think focusing on formative assessment here is probably the most useful. All right, so why would we do this? Well, using lots of this data, particularly from those formative assessments, is going to help us to understand exactly where our students are at, where the knowledge gaps are that they currently have, and where they might need or some extension. It's going to help us to make sure that we differentiate accordingly for our classes to make sure that everyone in our class is going to improve in their learning outcomes. So before we move on and look at some examples, I just want to direct you to the additional resources button at the bottom of this video, where you'll be able to find a knowledge bank article that will give you some more information about how to do this, and also a link to our blog where you'll find lots of information on pedagogy and how to implement best practice in your classroom using Edrolo. All right, so for our first example, we're going to look at how we can use the class progress dash to get some of this data and then plan how we're going to adjust our lessons moving forward. So I'm just going to move down to Electron Configuration Part 2, and after your students have watched the video and completed the content, you'll be able to see all of the data here. I do recommend making sure that you get your students to flip that learning, because it gives you a bit more of an opportunity to actually action things. Otherwise, you kind of get the data a little bit too late and then we can't do much about it then. So by flipping this, I've got this data and I can then plan for my next lesson. What we can see here is I've got my class and I can see what content my students have viewed, and I can also order it by their self-rating, their quiz scores, so the multiple choice scores, and also the amount of content that they viewed. Once I've done that, I might actually just look at the data at a question by question level to see if I can identify any trends. And I can see here that as my students have moved through, the content has gotten a little bit more tricky and they've started to have a bit more trouble. So this last question here and the second last question were a little bit more tricky than the first two. So I might choose to do some intervention here and go back over those questions as a class, or I might do that with a small group, and that's the question. Alternatively, we can go back in and look at data. I've just picked that same data set, and I can look at things at a student by student level. I might actually order this by their quiz scores, because then I can see my learners who are struggling down the bottom here. And this might be that they've rushed through questions. I might have more context, so please use your teacher judgment, but it also might mean that I might do some one-on-one interventions with those students too. For our second example, we're going to look at the review questions dash. So once your students have completed the questions online, you'll be able to go to view how they've gone. So I'm just going to click in here. Firstly, you'll get an overview of all of the responses question by question. So if you did want to click in and see if there were any trends with particular answers that maybe students were getting wrong, you'll be able to see them there. Otherwise, I like to have a look at the view responses view. This gives you a data grid so that you can unpack what's going in your class a little bit better. So just be mindful, you do have some filters up the top. I like to toggle off the correct answers just because it makes my view a little bit nicer, and I tend to look for the incorrect answers. So I'm just going to click that. You'll notice that all of the multiple choice questions are automatically marked for you, so you don't have to do any additional marking there. Yay for us. And you can see that they've been graded as well. Now, the red boxes are where students have self-reflected that they need help, whereas the little red triangles tell me that a student's actually gotten that question wrong. So I could look at the trends in that and identify, well, are there some multiple choice questions that are particularly tricky, or are there particular students that need help, like this student here? So we can look at trends like that. For our short answer questions, we can do something similar, but keep in mind that these don't get automatically marked. Students have the opportunity to self-mark. So I can see some students here have on 11B, they have identified that they need a little bit of help. So if I click into that question, we can then direct our students to go back and look at this checklist and maybe do some of that self-marking. That's a good starting point. Have they actually engaged with that or not? Have a look at that exemplar response And then they've also got the video solution here. If they've already done that, once you've checked in, then you might plan some differentiated activities or some next steps for those students. All right, so we've talked a lot about data, but sometimes it can be really overwhelming when you have all of this data and you just don't really know what to do with it. So I've pulled some data here from a platform and I'm going to show you how we can actually use this to differentiate our whole class. So what I've got here is something called the differentiation diamond. And you'll see that it's separated into different tiers for different types of instruction. At tier 1, this is where you'll find most of your students sitting for differentiated or core instruction. At tier 2, we're starting to differentiate a little bit more, and that's for students who might need some intervention or our students who need some enrichment. And then right on the ends, we've got our tier 3 students who definitely need some differentiation. That's quite intensive, and that could be intensive intervention or it could be intensive enrichment. So let's look at how we can use this data set to start placing our students into this diamond so we can then plan our next steps for the class. So the part that I like to use is the average quiz scores, which is this section here. And what I like to do is I like to go through and scan and identify, okay, well, where do I see some very low quiz scores? What's roughly my class average? What's roughly the highest scores that we're getting here? So looking at this, like my class average is, probably going to be quite high for this class. You can see a lot of my students are sitting in the 80%, sort of 100% for those quizzes. And I've got some students down the other end. You know your learners best, so you might also decide what tiers they sit on the basis of some other information that you have too. So what I might do then is I might take my students and identify which tiers they're going to go into, and you could list their names out and draw this diamond if you want to. So I know that these 2 students at the top are going to need some intervention. I might know that the students who've all done very well here all require some enrichment. And then I might know that a couple of these students here need regular enrichment, but a couple of my 80% students, I might actually know that they're part of my core instruction, but they've done really well and improved on this quiz. And then I might have this last student here, fondly named Wicked Wildebeest, who's going into our intervention. From there, I might decide to set some differentiated activities or differentiate homework and tasks through the platform for my students as well, so that they're all getting what they need.